if we look at the carcass traits, there are some significant changes that can occur and do occur very frequently. Again, we have talked a little bit at length about muscle hypertrophy and protein accretion. And one way that that's expressed is through increased area, I guess you could say, in terms of square inches of the total longissimus muscle, in particular the loini area, if you look at the 12th rib surface. And pretty much every paper I was able to find, as well as reviews, essentially confirmed this, is that this is one uniform characteristic we see across the board, is that implants, no matter what, generally, what the timing is, what implant was used, was there a re-implant scheme, overall, across the board, you will see and would expect to see larger loini areas from implanted cattle when compared to control cattle that were not implanted. Increased skeletal maturity, you can see, especially more so in heifers, maybe a little bit more pronounced maturity in terms of skeleton. However, it didn't correspond to an overall maturity that you might see if you started to evaluate more mature beef that you might expect to see from maybe something that's grass finished over a longer period of time, or cow beef. And so certainly those type of carcasses are going to have a little bit more maturity, just to get them, in terms of the grass-fed animals, just to get them a little bit more to an acceptable weight. And then on the cow side of things, they're obviously going to have a lot more keratin, elastin, and some of those more fibrogenous proteins in terms of the muscle tissue. And so you don't necessarily see that in terms of the muscle maturity. But through kind of just an increased growth, mainly in terms of affecting this calculation, is that implants do tend to make more favorable yield grades, and so they are going from some of those more fattier carcasses who might yield grade 4, and getting them to a yield grade 3, or getting them closer to a yield grade 3. And really probably where they have the most effect is where you have an acceptable amount of back fat, and there's just an increase in the total lean from the implant, and you're bringing those cattle that could be yield grade 3, maybe above 3, and you're bringing them down to below a 3 or closer to a 3. And so you can see an improved yield grade, and probably the biggest source of that would be through that increased percent lean and ribeye area in particular. Now, the data is not in 100% agreement on this, so you can, if you were to look up some of this information, you would probably see some studies that really didn't see too much of a significant effect on kidney, pelvic, and heart fat within the carcass, of different animals that received one or another type of implant. And that may be one of the issues why there hasn't been a confirmation on that data. But overall, you can probably see a decrease in KPH or no change in KPH. So that kidney, pelvic, and heart fat area in terms of total fat, has been either shown to decrease or stay the same. Lower marbling scores is probably one of the more pronounced and measurable ways you can see an issue perhaps with carcass quality factor that's more unfavorable, and probably more pronounced, or at least more thought of, than the increase in the loini area. However, the two of them may be connected and we'll discuss that here shortly. So, overall, there's not a whole lot of literature that really talks too much about the or about a potential lipolytic effect of the of different implants, and certainly when you look at the 12th rib back fat data on beef carcasses, there has not been too much of an indication, positive or negative, that implantation of trenbolone acetate, estradiol combinations, or Zeranol has had an effect on 12th rib back fat to any significant degree. So again, increase in muscle hypertrophy, protein buildup in the skeleton or the carcass, and the animal itself, increasing the loini area and longissimus muscle in particular. And you can have a little bit of an increase in skeletal maturity, but it doesn't really overall impact quality grade, or at least not to that degree. And then you do improve the yield grades by lowering them within a certain range. Probably mainly due to that loini increase in size. However, you probably may not have a discernible impact on KPH, but you will have lower marbling scores generally, and across different implant schemes, and even with one implant and a low potency implant, you can still see lower marbling scores. And again, even with that, you don't see a whole lot of effect on 12th rib back fat. So talked a little about KPH, marbling, and 12th rib back fat. So briefly on fat deposition again, and we're going to be reducing marbling scores, and I've got a little bit of data I can show you here shortly. But remarbling scores do seem to be more pronounced when you have a reimplant program, or you have a maybe later stage high implant or high dose implant. And some changes can certainly be due to the genetics of the animal, as well as the diet itself and what the energy content is. However, with a more aggressive implant strategy, higher and more potent implants with repeated implants, generally you can expect quality grade to decrease with lower marbling scores. And especially lower marbling scores, which can reduce quality grade. Now, the fatty acid composition itself, and if you look at the actual fatty acid chains, and if they are indeed significantly altered by the addition of an implant. And so far the data is a little bit inconclusive. It does seem to be a trend that you can increase the polyunsaturated fatty acids. However, certainly overall they have moved, but the statistics are a little bit open to interpretation on how they can affect the composition of fatty acids within the a steak itself. In this case, this was a study looking at, or these were studies looking at loini area. So adipocytes, one thing that was a little bit interesting to me is that actually, I guess perhaps through growth promotion effect, is that adipocyte number actually had increased when you implanted cattle. However, the diameter and the actual size of those adipocytes remain unchanged. And the other thing that's important to think about in terms of fat deposition, especially when we're trying to get back to the issue of marbling and intramuscular fat in a loini area, or at any particular steak, especially or roast, is just a relationship between the muscularity, which in most instances is going to be represented by a loini or ribeye estimation of size, or the actual size, and the intramuscular fat or the marbling that's within that surface cut of that muscle. And one thing to kind of illustrate this relationship really quickly is that several papers that I was able to reference did really note a negative relationship between the ribeye area and intramuscular fat, which is to say that as ribeye area or loin-eye area increase, you could expect, all other things equal and in general, that intramuscular fat will decrease, and you would describe that as probably an inverse relationship. And to kind of demonstrate this, I was trying to do it graphically, and I didn't have a very good data set. However, I did find some data from our steer carcass show here, basically in my home county up here in Virginia. And this data is from show steers from our 4-H and FFA members that have shown in our local show and have had their steers entered into the carcass contest. And to kind of show that potential negative relationship, I decided to plot it out and look at marbling, individual marbling score, and then look at the marbling score itself, and then the ribeye area. And overall, I did have to manipulate this data a little bit. However, I did want to do that for demonstration purposes. Really quickly, you can probably discern that I did average the marbling scores themselves. And I guess when we took this data last year, we only looked at the actual grade itself, either choice, prime, or select. However, for this purpose, I converted them to numbers or a numerical score, and I just averaged them. So really quickly, if you look at 600, that would be a choice plus. So 600 would be choice plus, and I just averaged everything that was above a choice, or that I wrote down a choice plus at, so that we gave them a 650 for the purpose of this graph. And that's true for your choice steers, or upper two-third, or middle choice steers, and that would be those that are around 500, and your low choice steers are going to be 400 score, and then you're going to have a select probably there around 300, or select plus. And so even though I kind of got a little bit of manipulation on this data, I did want to point out that if you kind of look at this scatter plot and this regression, as you see that you have larger loin-eye areas, you can probably expect a lower marbling score. We did have a steer that actually did have a 17.2 ribeye area, and he did have a little bit of a lower marbling score. And I don't know if he was implanted or not. But that just kind of explains that relationship a little bit. So some of the possible reasons for this could be one of the following is a dilution theory. So with the increase in the size of the muscle of the loin eye, you can probably expect look and not really see a corresponding increase to go along with that muscle growth in the intramuscular fat. So they call that a dilution theory, in which you have an expanding ribeye area, but you don't have expanding intramuscular fat to keep the marbling score at par. And so therefore you have a decrease in the marbling score. And so that does have some merits to that, and is probably a factor in why cattle that do receive implants, and perhaps more than one implant, do have lower marbling scores. We talked a little bit at length about marbling. There are some other aspects of beef quality and carcass quality that can affect that are affected by implants, and one of these is tenderness. And Warner-Bressler shear force is one objective way of measuring that tenderness. And if we look at this picture, the Warner-Bressler shear force machine, if you will, essentially resembles a drill press and works in a similar fashion, and can drill a core through a steak, and then have a monitor record the amount of force it took to cut through that steak. And they do have, through the second opinions of sensory panels, which we will talk about in a second, they've been able to kind of assign, what a Warner-Bressler shear force tender, very tender, and a tough recommendation would be. So literature describes 3.9 to 5.54 kilograms Warner-Bressler shear force to be tender beef, and then cuts less than 3.9 kilograms would be very tender beef, and then cuts that are greater than 4.54 would be characterized as tough. Now, looking at some data available on the Warner-Bressler shear force and different implant schedules and different implant treatments, you have different implants here. Basically an implant and then a re-implant schedule, and this were for steers that were on feed. You have a number of them in 298, and if you do kind of study this data, the WBS value is an average of that particular subset of animals, which they have over in the fourth column, which is the number of animals, and the WBS value shows the average of that group, and the number of animals also has a percent that were below. It's basically divided into two columns, but there's a column for the number of animals that were below 3.9 kilograms of shear force, and a column for those animals that were above 3.9 kilograms of shear force. And looking at that, you can kind of determine that despite different implant treatments, we still have a high number of animals that are being reported below 3.9 kilograms in terms of percents in particular. However, that number does seem to decrease for most implants in a significant amount. But overall, they do remain in that tender, at least tender categorization, and there could be a few that could be tender or above over here as well. It's hard to discern if there were any tough steaks with with this data. Tough again being over 4.54 kilograms shear force. So I hope you can see the slide. This is the best I could do with this background, but I did want to explain, or at least have a visual of timing of implants and how many potential implants you could probably expect, and this is a possibility of a steer or a heifer to have, by the time that their life is ended. And here you have calf birth over here on the right, and this could be February through December of any year, which picks up again in January. This would be probably for a early spring calving herd, and this calf here denotes the actual birth date of the calf. Ignoring some of the lines that don't have captions for, if you have a suckling implant, which is for calves that are under 400 pounds that are not weaned, one improved implant would be Ralgro. Branding would be a time frame in which, if you're a Western operation out west, that's probably one way you're going to use to identify the calves. And you might do that actually probably sooner than what I have on that particular map. Maybe even as early as April. You probably would follow up with another implant at weaning, or you could possibly. This is just just show potential times of implants. What they could be, and then probably at some point during a backgrounding phase before cattle are entered into a feedlot, whether they're grazing on pasture. And that's probably very common with the fall calving herd. And then if they're being backgrounded on hay and some sort of grain or silage, as it would be the case here, at least in our part of the world, up here in Virginia, as well as an implant possible upon feedlot entry, and then maybe even a re-implant during the feedlot phase. So overall, looking at it, you can have potentially 5 implants during the life of the calf. So, that begs the question as to, well, what data can we ascribe to, having multiple implants? Does that affect to a greater degree some of these carcass characteristics? This is some data from Platter and co-workers from 2003, and she really looked at 10 or actually 11 different implant strategies, basically made on timing, in addition to having some different implants as well used across these treatments. And if you read the captions here below the table, you can kind of see overall how the different implants that were used. And then if you look at the table itself, number 1 through 10 is how you match those actual treatments up. And you can see that there's pretty much a wide range of from the control to the 5 implant system, and surprisingly, you don't see a linear decrease if you go from left to right, with the right side trials having a few more up to 4 or 5 implants compared to 1 or 2 for most of the trials, 1 through 5 or 6. Overall, well, actually to 7. Overall, you don't see too much of a large correlation there, and actually, when you look at the statistical measures on this, that kind of confirms a light amount of evidence showing, at least with this study. And again, there were some different implants used across these treatments rather than one, and trying to look at only the timing. You do see a kind of a lack of a strong correlation between more implants turning into a greater shear force. Suffice to say, however, you do have a significant increase with these implants over control calf or control steers and heifers. And if you study a little bit further, you actually see a stronger characteristic decrease the more implants that you use, for the most part, for the a little bit more pronounced decrease with more implants from in terms of marbling score, which is a little bit of an untethering from the tenderness data. One more thing, looking at the sensory panel, which I did want to get to, is generally sensory panels will be used to kind of show a more human evaluation of what a steak should be, and so generally these studies will randomly select or have someone randomly select some potential candidates, and they just confirm that these individuals are beef consumers, and doing a blind taste sampling, or asked to kind of rate on a scale, how they feel about different beef products they're eating. Of course, I'm like, well, where can I sign up for this? But at any rate, there's looking at the tenderness data, and there's some other characteristics there that they're evaluating as well, or tough or meat characteristics. And overall, you do see a larger number for steaks that were implanted versus control across all characteristics that were evaluated here. However, for a majority here of most most steaks, they're rating that number closer. Overall, there's not a large sensory change. However, looking at this data, there is a little bit of a jump from a control steer to an implanted steer. So there is some, even though you have a Warner Brasler shear force, which is the actual a measure of tenderness itself in terms of what it takes to cut a steak, then there's the sensory analysis, how does it really feel and taste, and what enjoyment do we get out of it, and so there is potential here, at least for this study, is there might be a little bit something more to against multiple implants in terms of tenderness, but that can be shown in a different light, in a different sensory panel, but I think it is well thought to say that it can have different effects on meat tenderness, as a sensory panel would describe it. Now, not spending a whole lot of time on this review and looking at estrogenic activity of implanted beef, and certainly this number's a little bit on the harsher side. I think if you really wanted to study in great detail, you could see more differences, maybe in terms of number of implants, and how that might change this difference. However, considering in the grand scheme of things, the estrogenic activity of implanted beef when compared to other foods and to beef itself, it's really not that significant. And even with a rigorous implant scheme, it doesn't really appear that it would be, and that just an inhuman consumption of beef would be needed to really meet some of these other levels of estrogenic activity from other foods. Certainly that's consumer preferences as to what they what they would like to consume. But overall, the scientific data shows a very benign response in terms of additional hormones in beef that was produced from calves that had received an implant. So in summary, implant regimens are effective in increasing beef production efficiency, especially in terms of average daily gain and feed-to-gain ratios. And then with more aggressive implant schemes and reimplantations, you can see a little bit more decrease in terms of marbling score and a potential decrease in quality grade. If you were a feedlot operator, probably one thing that you would look at is developing an implant scheme that's going to have a minimum effect on our marbling grade, and you would look at really evaluating a system of designing an implant scheme that's going to keep the final yield grades in mind, especially if you're selling direct to a packer, and also balancing how much more average daily gain you would like to get and improve feed efficiency in terms of trying to produce more beef with the same amount of feed. Now, also, there's not a whole lot of large effects on skeletal maturity, and really that marbling score being the biggest effect on the on quality grade over anything on maturity wise. And then there's a little effect in terms of total hormone content in beef, especially when compared to other foods, and really the beef versus implanted beef issue is a very marginal amount in terms of estrogen levels. So here are some of the references for further reading, and I really recommend all of these. If you have some interest in how the two the components can work in combination, the effects of timing of implants in terms of final performance, just overall reviews in terms of stocker production, and then how the hormones interact with each other and how they could affect the fat deposition, how they stimulate muscle, and then strategies to try to reduce any loss in marbling grade due to implants. Very good reading here, and if you have time, some of them are worth a read. So that concludes my presentation.